Elemental architecture. This lecture is designed to show what elemental thinking is and how it was used in avant-garde architecture in the 20th century. It is still used today, but I won't have time now to talk about that. It is important to understand the basic concepts of elemental thinking were formed in the 19th century. The most influential theory can be found in the work of a German architect called Gottfried Semper, and so I will begin with him. Let's start with some background information about Semper. In his early career, Semper had a very good position in the German city of Dresden, where he built important public buildings and ran the architecture course at the university. In the mid-19th century, Germany was a collection of principalities and not, as were Great Britain and France, a nation-state. Semper and many other people of his social class did not like this political arrangement. In 1948, Semper was involved in protests against the perceived backwardness of German socio-political arrangements. The protests failed and Semper was arrested and exiled. After living in Paris for a while, he came to London, where he remained until 1855. In those days, Britain was the epicentre of a process called industrialisation, which was giving rise to new forms of architecture and urbanism. At the time Semper arrived, London must have been an exciting place to be, but also strange, alarming, and sometimes even shocking. While exiled in London, Semper worked on a book he was writing called Style in the Technical and Tectonic Arts, or Practical Aesthetics. As he worked on his book, inevitably his thinking was informed by his experiences of London. Semper needed to give his practical aesthetics some foundational ideas, but he wanted to avoid the classical principles that haunted architectural theory in those days. Semper decided to base his practical aesthetics on 4 common methods of building, which he called the elements of architecture. They are tectonics, or carpentry, stereotomics, or masonry, textiles, or weaving, pottery, or ceramics. In Semper's theory, the elements come before architecture. They are born out of the day-to-day necessities of living in a primitive agrarian society. In other words, a society based on farming. They are the basis of activities like making clothes, domestic furnishings, pens and fences for keeping animals, temporary structures for ritual events, and dwellings for shelter. However, when the elements eventually are used to create architecture, then each one becomes a symbol of a specific building form. Tectonics symbolises the roof or frame, stereotomics symbolises the platform, plinth or podium, textiles symbolises the screen, curtain wall or barrier, pottery symbolises the hearth or fireplace. Furthermore, each symbol is poetically linked to a primitive terrestrial element. Tectonics is linked to air, stereotomics is linked to earth, textiles is linked to water, and pottery is linked to fire. Now we'll look a little more carefully at all this in a moment. For now, I want to turn to a very important event that took place at the time Semper was in London. Today, it's hard to imagine the excitement of the first international exhibition for industry and art, which opened in Hyde Park on the 1st of May, 1851. The exhibition was housed in a new kind of building made from metal and glass. It was called the Crystal Palace. At the time, people claimed The large metal and glass building gave them entirely new kinds of feelings and sensations. Here is how one architect visitor to the Crystal Palace described it. We are in an artificially created environment that has already ceased to be a space. We are separated from nature, but yet we are scarcely conscious of it. The barrier that separates us from the landscape is barely perceptible. We find ourselves, so to speak, in a piece of sculpted atmosphere. The sun's rays come to us not through individual openings. They fill the space with a completely beautiful naturalness, and as the sun of this space does not give or allow the light to be anything special or particular, so we must also be content with the fact that the colours borrow their limits from the objects outside. In this way, it is like a magical, poetic form of light. Now for us, living in the early 21st century, enormous metal and glass buildings are nothing out of the ordinary. In fact, we have rather come to disapprove of them. We tend to associate those materials with the climate crisis and all its associated problems. But for a person who was experiencing a large metal and glass building for the first time, it was remarkable. And I think the notion of being in a piece of sculpted atmosphere is a good metaphor for what it might actually have felt like to stand in the Crystal Palace. Semper was involved in the design of a number of the exhibitions inside the palace. He even designed a theatre, shown in this drawing, which unfortunately was never built. Notice how Semper drew the actual metal and glass building as a framework of lines fading into the sky. But Semper wasn't very interested in metal and glass and sculpted atmosphere. What fascinated him were the exhibits inside. It is said that he visited them every day, familiarising himself with the various items placed on display. One item Semper found especially interesting was a one-to-one model of a Caribbean hut from Trinidad, which to him seemed to embody the four elements in a remarkable way. Because the idea of the four elements had come to Semper before he saw the Caribbean hut, when he did see it, he immediately read it as empirical evidence that justified his theory. Semper's practical aesthetics includes a drawing and written description of the Caribbean hut, and I am now going to use those to demonstrate the four elements to you. To begin with, tectonics. In Semper's system, any framework of posts, beams and rafters is a tectonic element. The framework of the hut was made from bamboo. I've coloured it dark blue in this drawing. Now let's look at the stereotomic element. In Semper's system, any platform, plinth or podium is a stereotomic element. You can see that the hut sits on a raised platform. I have coloured it green. And if you look closely, you can even see the markings of a course of brickwork or maybe stone. Turning now to the textile element, in Semper's system, any screen, barrier or curtain wall is a textile element. On the hut, you can see two kinds of textiles filling between the members of the frame. I have coloured them pale blue. On the sloping part, the textile element looks like it is made from tiles, while on the vertical part it is a wickerwork of some kind, perhaps made of rope or long grass. The textile element keeps out the rain and the sun, but, perhaps more importantly, it separates the building into an inside and an outside. Finally, we come to the pottery element. In Semper's system, any hearth or fireplace is a pottery element. On this drawing, I have coloured the hearth orange. It is represented by a round figure on the plan diagram and a raised bump on the elevation. One thing that often puzzles people about Semper is that it is very hard to find the elements in the buildings he designed. The reason they are hard to find is because, as I mentioned earlier, Semper thought of the elements as preconditions for architecture. He did not regard the elements themselves as sufficient for architectural creation. Semper believed a work of architecture should reflect its place in history, and since he believed he was living at an advanced stage of historical development, so the buildings he designed reflect that belief. As you can see from these pictures, Semper's buildings are highly ornamented and rich with symbolic reference. They represent his understanding of their moment in history and his own commitment to that moment. To see how the elements actually can be used in modern architectural design, we have to leave Semper behind and move into the 20th century. One architect whose work demonstrates elemental thinking in a very convincing way is Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. Mies, like many other architects of his generation, quite self-consciously tried to design elemental buildings. The reason he did so is because he believed architecture was under threat from modern technological progress. Mies wanted to save architecture from the destructiveness of progress. Please note, the word that is often used to refer to this kind of anti-progressive attitude is avant-garde. Mies asked two challenging questions. First, he asked, is it possible to reduce architecture down to just the four elements only? And second, he asked, is it possible to use industrial technology as a means of carrying architecture beyond destructive progress and into the future? Now, we could look at any of Mies's buildings and find the four elements, but the one I'm going to use is called the Farnsworth House. The Farnsworth House sits in a meadow beside a river some 60 miles west of the city of Chicago. It was designed and built between 1945 and 1950. In other words, right in the middle of the 20th century, just after the end of World War II. At that time, the consumer society that is responsible for climate change in our day was only just beginning to emerge. I should mention, Mies himself was German, but he had immigrated to America just before the war to escape from the National Socialist regime in Germany. The Farnsworth House was intended as a weekend retreat, not a full-blown residence. I hope you can see from this image a marked similarity between the Caribbean hut and the Farnsworth House is the way both buildings are dominated by the tectonic element, in other words, by the building frame. As we've seen, the frame of the hut was made from bamboo. With the Farnsworth House, it is made from an industrial product, namely rolled steel sections. In Semper's system, the tectonic element is characterised as a process of joining stick-shaped elastic components resistant to forces working along the length. You can see from this photograph how the Farnsworth frame bears those characteristics. The tectonic process will produce three-dimensional lattice structures that are open and relatively lightweight, which is why tectonics is linked to the terrestrial element air. This is a picture of another building by Mies from around the same time. It's a twinned apartment block in Chicago called Lakeshore Drive. In this picture, the buildings are still under construction. As you can see, each one is a lattice structure, relatively lightweight and open to the air. This is a picture of the buildings in their completed condition. You can't see the lattice now, but you can still see how it influences the appearance of the building. Returning to the Farnsworth House. The second similarity between the Farnsworth House and the Caribbean Hut is that both buildings are raised up and off the ground and sit on a kind of platform or plinth. In Semper's system, platforms and plinths are associated with a work process called stereotomics, or masonry. I've tried to illustrate masonry in the slide shown here. Masonry involves working with strong, densely aggregated materials that resist crushing and compression. The most common material used in masonry is stone. The mason will work the material into regular, systematic pieces that can be piled up on top of one another. With the Caribbean hut, the platform was obviously a masonry element, built either of bricks or blocks. But at the Farnsworth house, there is no masonry work to be seen, and yet there is a platform, and it does seem to have the same relation to the totality of the house as the masonry platform had to the totality of the hut. Notice that the Farnsworth platform is suspended within the steel framework and how the space below is left open. Now, it's not unusual for a platform to have open spaces below. Essentially, that is what a basement is. What is unusual is for the basement to be visible from the outside. Now, in the case of the Farnsworth house, there's a good reason for opening up the basement to the outside, because the meadow in which the house sits often floods, and when that happens, the open basement means the floodwaters can pass through. Moving up and onto the top of the platform, notice how the surface is paved with stone slabs. These are a more obvious reference to masonry. Turning now to the textile element. Both the hut and the house use processes of weaving to fabricate screens and barriers that fill in between the members of the frame. In the case of the hut, the screens were made of tiles for the roof and a wicker work of some kind for the walls. In the case of the house, the screens are woven out of steel and glass. To see more clearly what I mean, it is useful to return to the twin apartments at Lakeshore Drive. As you've already seen, the frame is enclosed by a curtain wall of steel and glass, woven between the voids of the lattice. Now, one consequence of using a lot of glass to make the screening element is that the textures of light and colour from outside are able to permeate into the interior. When looking at the interiors of the Farnsworth house, with the influx of colour from the meadow outside, one is reminded of the Crystal Palace and the idea of living in an artificial environment that is like a piece of sculpted atmosphere. Now, besides the light and colour, there's another kind of sculpting going on in the Farnsworth house. Notice the large, yellow, box-like entity that sits in the middle of the space. In this photograph, you can see it includes a fireplace. This yellow box is the pottery element. In Semper's terms, it is the hearth, and that is what I will call it from now on. If you look at this colour-coded drawing showing plan, diagram and sections, you can see how the form and position of the hearth actually sculpts the interior space of the house, shaping it into discrete living areas. So to the left of the hearth is a reception area. Behind the hearth is a narrow galley kitchen area. To the right is a sleeping area with a bed, and in front is the lounge area with the fireplace and comfortable chairs. But the hearth does more than shape the space of the house into 4 discrete areas. It also has spaces hollowed out inside. If we look at this plan, we can see inside the Farnsworth house and we begin to realise how complicated it is. And, moving in closer, we begin to realise it's full of pottery. Recollect, in Semper's system, the hearth is made from materials that are soft, malleable, easy to shape, and able to retain their shape when hardened. That is what he meant by pottery or ceramics. For example, the metal flue that carries away smoke from the fire and the electricity and water conduits are made from ductile materials, from metal or plastic. The bathroom features and fittings, the sink, the bath, the shower, are made from porcelain or plastic, all of them shaped to suit their functions. For Semper, what was especially important about the hearth was the way it served as a place for formalising social relationships. He wrote about it as the locus of exchange and communication. He wrote, "Around the hearth the first groups assembled, around it the first alliances formed, around it the first religious concepts were put into the customs of the cult. Throughout all phases of society, the hearth formed that sacred focus around which the whole took order and shape." Semper's speculations about the importance of the hearth draw our attention to a significant difference between the Caribbean hut and the Farnsworth house. With the hut, the hearth was a housing for the fire only. It was just a fireplace. It was located in the porch, the threshold between the inside and the outside of the building. At the Farnsworth house, the fireplace is just one specialised item amidst a whole range of pottery items installed inside the hearth. Compared to the hut, the Farnsworth hearth has expanded to become a small building nested inside the house, like a sanctuary inside a temple. Now, I want to draw your attention to something very important. Please notice how this small building inside a building is not only a space dividing element or a housing for the fireplace and bathrooms, it is also the entry point for an array of materials that are brought directly up and into the house from pipes, wires and conduits that run underground through the meadow outside. These include electricity and water, but also information technologies such as telephone, television, and today the internet. All these facilities are brought to the house by means of specialised distributive systems that work not at the scale of the building, but at the scale of the entire urban territory. The word that's often used to refer to distributed systems such as these is network. With the design of the Farnsworth house, Mies used elemental thinking to show how the fourth element, which in Semperian terms marks the locus of sociability, was about to be radically altered by life in a networked society. We, all of us, are living with the consequences of that radical alteration. We were born into a networked consumer society. If, as architects, we want to think elementally today, then we have to begin with Mies, just as he did with Semper. But we cannot use the same questions that Mies asked. It's up to us to formulate our own critical agenda for today.